certainly when you're going through a public process, there's an element of risk mitigation, right? Kind of what you were talking about with people aren't averse to risk, but they are averse to surprises. Then there's the uncertainty, which I think really impacts timing. That's when we talk about the election, it's uncertainty of the future, and whether you're going through a private transaction or an IPO, that's going to be a factor. And then there's what is your upside, your value creation after the event. I think what's really exciting to me personally is that a lot of companies exploring IPOs are running a dual track process, so they get a broader read on the market and the appetite through different routes. That does add an extra burden to your readiness because you are now exploring two very different types of transactions with different requirements. There can be some overlap, like forecasting and your corporate governance, your ability to report, whether it's going to be eventually to the SEC or if it's going to be to maybe a private equity owner or a large strategic corporation. Lots of overlap in that, but it does add some extra burden to that process.
I don't know that I'd say they prefer IPO. I think the optionality certainly is helpful. I think the cost of going through an M&A transaction, if they're just focused on that, will be less than going through the IPO process. And so it's all going to depend on valuation. So if they can get a valuation from an M&A transaction that's comparable to what they're talking about from an IPO perspective, I think they would probably lean more towards M&A. And we've seen, like, if you look at the numbers of how many transactions close in an M&A versus an IPO, it's certainly much more significant from an M&A perspective. But I think just having that optionality certainly gives some flexibility.
What, 15% was the average float sold in the IPO, so you retain a lot of upside if you only sell 15%. And then similarly, it's going to depend on your shareholder base. Like Viking was 85, 75% secondary, so that was the hedge funds who got it during the downturn selling out. So very, very fact specific. You know, a management team is not going to want to sell to a competitor. They'd rather go public and continue to be the management team. So really going to be fact specific.
So no one wants to get into an IPO process and then stub their toe and fail. So it's always good to have that dual track. The readiness is all there to be demonstrable in the submission. But really, you know, you're talking about the application of D&O in those contexts where when you're talking about a D-SPAC in this environment where there's very little cash, they may not even make minimum cash coming through. There's no cash to hit the balance sheet concurrently with any raise, with any pipe or anything. Now, the idea behind D&O and indemnification becomes absolutely critical. You're talking about potential insolvency, right, in the first 12 months of the policy. When you're talking about M&A, you don't have that issue, so now you're focused on reps and warranties and you're applying different cover. So you're not necessarily focused on D&O, you're more lubricating the transaction with transactional liability products. So again, it just depends.